There's really nothing else that is there except for this sort of monopolization on violence that's happened. And finally, we find ourselves not in an industrial society anymore, but an information society. And in an information society, money is actually a construct. So it's a vector of your basically of your attention and effort through time in a particular direction. So we don't have a money that's fully derived from this yet, but we also don't have money that's really based off of fiat. So crypto, like Bitcoin, is a implementation technology insofar as it's getting everybody used to the idea of a digitally determined currency. And in Bitcoin's case, it is scarce. And so therefore it has value based on what everybody believes. But what it is doing, it's opening up the world to a place where every person is a central bank for their own currency. And that currency is a derivative of their own attention and effort. And the way that I like to think about this is there is infinite free porn on the internet, and yet people pay a lot of money to OnlyFans creators. And
Hmm.
the question is why? It's not because the underlying asset, in this case, pictures of tits or whatever, it's because of the attention and effort of the creator on the person, right? It's like, and that securitization of an intangible asset being attention and effort, that is ultimately what our currency will be. So when you transact with someone in the future with their digital coin, that the value of that digital coin as traded against everyone else's digital coin will be a function of that person's ability to create economic value by directing their attention and effort.
Yeah. Yeah. A lot of really interesting thoughts there. The first thought I had is that the various kinds of modalities or levels over time that you're describing, including the one I described of money being life, is they don't seem mutually exclusive to each other. It seems to me they layer on top of each other, and the arrival of
That
one
is
doesn't.
exactly correct. So, like,
Yeah.
for example, today in the industrial sense of money, you still have commodity sense of money and you still have trust sense of money. So, like,
Right.
in a large family unit where you might have a lot of aunts and uncles, people are always giving each other debits and credits in the form of debts, which they
Mm.
don't really report to the government or anybody else. This sort of just happens in the family. So that is that barter economy that's still there. And then we still need to be able to make food. That is the thing, right? And
Right.
in an information society, you're still going to need to be able to wage war as a society so people don't steal your shit. So you're absolutely correct. They're not mutually exclusive. All of the previous versions are contained like a Venn diagram where the circle keeps getting
Hmm.
bigger
Hmm.
in the next version. And really, the reason why it grows is because our ability to securitize things gets better through time. So initially, we didn't have the technology to securitize anything more than what we could store in our heads. Then, with writing and et cetera, we were able to securitize like large societies. So we would, if you look at the Babylonian cruciform tablets from 5,000, 7,000 years ago, they all say such and such king has this many acres of land and this many oxen, et cetera, et cetera. That's a
Hmm.
form of securitization. And then with industrial, we again, because of paper records and our ability to conduct activities over multiple generations, that allowed us to securitize GDP in an effective way so that we could have a fiat currency. And it's the same thing with information. As we get digital currencies where the cost of transaction goes well below pennies, right? So effectively like a millionth of a penny, and the
Hmm.
transaction speed goes up, now it will be possible to securitize things like attention. And so you've seen many attempts to securitize attention already. So there's the thing where you pay $50 a month and then it goes to your web browser, and then your web browser looks at a website. And depending on how many minutes you spend reading that website, it gives a fractional portion of that money.
Hmm.
That's not efficient yet, because if you look at something like Bitcoin, the transaction costs are like $35 a Bitcoin. It's like fucking
Right.
crazy.
$35, no matter how little or how much you move, basically.
E- Exactly. Right. And so if you look at the credit card system today, the minimum transaction cost is like 25 cents. And so it really doesn't even make sense to transact with credit cards for items that are below a dollar, which is why no real merchant accepts those kinds of transactions, except in
Mhm.
very specific large scale cases. But as soon as you get a technology that allows us to transact for a tenth of a penny or a hundredth of a penny or a thousandth of a penny, you're going to see these intangible assets like your preference graph, right? So people advertise to me very poorly because I am not able to securitize my own digital preference graph. But if they knew, for example, that right now I want Thai food, then a local Thai restaurant would be heavily incentivized to advertise to me. But I'm not able to make money by keeping that data structure up to date. And so it doesn't stay up to date.
Yeah. So let's turn to it for a minute about, just to put it in glib terms, how it all goes wrong. We've heard about the moral hazards of things like fractional lending. We've seen the consequences of bad loans. And of course, there's individual problems as well. People mismanaging money, and which I think often stems from misunderstanding of what it is. And we've all made mistakes with money, but then we see that multiplied 1,000-fold on the level of governments, ending up with things like the Weimar Republic and Argentina and us. And as basically we're seeing the value of the dollar has gone down dramatically over the course of my life, and down even more dramatically in the past several years. And we call that inflation. And it just seems to me that a lot of times people aren't paying attention and aren't actually engaging in their civic responsibility to understand these things. And then other people who have very narrow interests, very short-term interests, essentially co-opt power in government for those interests. And that basically hurts everybody ultimately. And we're seeing that with the bailout of SVB, which never should have had to happen as far as I'm concerned. And I don't know if it'll spread or not, and it's spread a little bit, but it doesn't have to be an absolute disaster to teach us something. But I fear that we're not going to learn anything from this kind of situation.
But I don't even look at it that way. And so I don't really understand what there is to actually learn if we really think
Okay.
about it. So,
Well,
like,
well,
for
go ahead.
example, I believe that money is a socially constructed idea. And so, to the extent that your society is no longer able to come to consensus on things, and again, to remind people, we can't come to consensus on what it means to be a woman. So, how can we come to consensus on what does it mean to have a bailout, or what is a bank run, or what is depositor insurance versus not? What it falls down to, from my perspective, is a bunch of gangs that try and get control, and then they just say, okay, we're going to do this or we're going to do like that. And when I think about the value of the dollar, because you said something interesting. You said the value of the dollar has gone down in your lifetime.
The buying power in absolute terms, yeah, of
Yeah.
the dollar, even though people are being paid more too. So I do get there's a give and take there.
Yeah. The way that I look at that again is if we look at the power of the dollar zone to coordinate effort and attention, is it better or worse than 50 years ago? And I would say that it is massively better. So the value that gets created in the entire economy is maybe like way bigger today than it was in the 1950s. And so, even though in nominal absolute terms, the purchasing power of an individual dollar has gone down 80% or whatever it is, I think it's 80%. The goods that are purchased from the entire collection of that economy are better, which I think is very weird. And one way to think about this as well, when you also like, it costs $1 million in the 1920s was roughly 87 million to $100 million today if you convert it into a commodity like gold. And there were vice presidents of Standard Oil who were building $3 million houses in Manhattan in the 1920s. I'm not aware of anyone who's building a $300 million house in New York City today. And so it's very interesting to think about not just the individual buying power of the dollar, but the distribution of dollars. Because I think that if you think about like the way that the society works, I actually think it's much more fair, if you will. There's a much more even distribution of dollars today than there was in the 1920s. And I think that is a function of our technology capability, not some BS social program.
Yeah, I definitely think that there's a great argument in the idea that it's not just the rich getting richer and the poor getting poorer. The rich are getting richer and so are the poor. The standard of living now worldwide is far above what it's ever been in human history. And to a certain extent, I agree that's due to wider distribution of money, basically, and the improvement of technology.
So how do you think about money? How should we think about money going forward? So there's a lot of volatility. And so I'll just say this, maybe that'll get us back on track. There's a lot of volatility in the world today. And so what I think I always like to give people sort of practical advice. And my practical advice and the advice that I follow myself is you should be useful. if you are always working on trying to be useful, then there will always be a position for you in the society in which your use can be made use of. So that's why you should always be learning and you should be curious about new things and what are people doing and try new stuff. Because I think when there's high volatility, if you just focus on, okay, if I can just learn to be useful, I'll be all right. I'm not going to starve. You know what I mean? I think a lot of people are afraid that AI will replace everything and then people will just be in the street like a homeless person and starving. And I just don't see that happening.
I agree that, when you create value, you create money. People are willing to pay you for the value you create. And that could be at a low level. That could even be working a fast food job, or it could be creating the next new great startup or a piece of software or whatever. But if you are in fact doing something people value, they do pay you for it. And that's basically proof of that value. That's not to say there's monetary is the only kind of value there is, but it's one of the most obvious and measurable ones in the world. And I definitely agree that, yeah, if you want to be have a good chance at both material success as well as contentment in terms of various kinds of fulfillment, money gives you options and money. And so it's good to make money. On the other hand, I think that when you look at a lot of things that are causing volatility and instability in our society right now, specifically related to money, we see things like the US government's debt to GDP ratio far exceeding anything that has been considered to be reasonable in the past. And we're still calling it reasonable now because of the full faith and credit of the United States. But I feel like at some point that's got to end. That's got to be reined in. No progression, especially a geometric one, can go on forever. And I feel like in addition to the things we need to do as individuals, we need to be focusing on the society we're living in and make sure that we're at least insulating ourselves from the shocks that inevitably come, but we're also hopefully educating each other about how to prevent or at least avoid some of the worst of them, because we've definitely seen governments collapse in horrible collapses in the past. And why do we think we're better than that? And if we're careful, especially if we've got that kind of hubristic approach to things.
Yeah, I think of it a little bit differently again. I don't think the US is going to collapse because it prints infinite money. I believe that the world is one economic zone at this point, and the US has effectively colonized the world through its dollar. And so when we print infinite money here, it means that poor people are going to suffer in the rest of the world. And the extent to which people here are unaware of people starving in Zimbabwe or whatever, they're not really going to care. And because we have food that's completely, it's not just that we have money and a military here in the US and we're dependent on, say, like Australia for food. We have all of our own food. And so I don't believe that there is a reason, so long as the US is able to wield the largest army, which means basically functionally just keeping high ground. And since everything is digital, like we just keep digital supremacy, which functionally in my mind comes down to just making sure all software is written in English, then there's no limit to how much the US can print. And I think that the politicians had come to this understanding as well. They call it modern monetary
Economic
theory.
theory.
Yeah. And I think like functionally what that means is they're just going to print into infinity. And there is no, the check on it is that like everyone else in the world dies or they get together and militarily overthrow the US. But like I said, unless they're able to rapidly educate their populace in advanced technologies, so like satellites and basically cyber intrusion, security, and software. Because again, the theater of the war has shifted from nations shooting each other with bombs to basically what's going on in cyberspace, right? Because what you're trying to do is you're trying to collect as much attention and effort as possible in an information society, and where the attention and effort has the highest multiplier on where people point it. So if everybody is the ditch digger, then their attention is not worth as much as if they're able to use technology to create incredible leverage. So I don't believe the US we probably go to 1,000 to 1 GDP to debt ratio and nothing would really happen. I think from the US perspective, I think the rest of the world would suffer incredibly as we were already seeing, but I don't believe that anything would happen up until the point where the entire world economy collapsed. Because I don't,
Like I say, it can't go off forever. And I appreciate you're taking a very kind of realpolitik approach in that analysis, but you're also seem to be acknowledging that this is actually accumulating a kind of debt that, if it continues unchecked, will come due at some point. And so it doesn't sound to me like you're entirely defending that realpolitik approach either. Is that correct?
well, I don't think so. I'm really from a certain class where I believe everything should be tasteful and seemly. And so I don't think it's seemly for us to get ahead while people are starving in Madagascar. I think that's very distasteful. right? I don't particularly like that you can go to Tripoli and buy people right now for $500, or you can do like child sex tourism to Ghana. And again, I think that all of these things are a function of US monetary and central bank policy. And so I find these things very unseemly. And for me, it's not even a ignorance is bliss, out of sight, out of mind. The people who know don't care and the people who care don't know sort of thing. I
Mhm.
just don't think this is how we should act when we're in a position of power. And we,
So you're
and
saying that the U.S. essentially has that we ought to act out of kind of a noblesse oblige kind of thing, as the ones in power, we have a greater obligation to act in a moral way towards the rest of the world, even if
yes,
we choose to, even if we act to maintain that hegemony.
yes. So I think, okay, humans are always going to be at war, right? We've always been at war with East Asia. We will always be at war with East Asia. And so I believe that we have an obligation to our citizens, like the homeless guy on the street who's homeless because he has mental issues and no one will help him. And so now he's addicted to drugs. I think that we have an obligation to that person by the function that we live in society. Now, the guy doesn't need to drive a Ferrari, but we do need to like get him some very basic mental health. And I think that if we are going to control the entire world through our policies, then we have an obligation to treat people with a little bit more dignity than we do. And I don't think that it's socially or morally acceptable the way that we allow a lot of these things to happen. And it's fine. It's okay. We're not going to do those things. And then of course we can allow them to happen. But like there are wars and genocides going on right now that you can't name because they're happening in Africa and certain parts of Asia that are not interesting, right? You can talk about how ISIS wiped out the Yazidi or the CCP is having some challenges with the people on their western border. But we don't hear,
Or the Uyghur.
that's what I'm talking about, but
Yeah.
I don't want
Yeah.
to say like there are other genocides that are happening in the world that we just don't care about. And my question is, why do we care about like Ukraine, right? Which is the most corrupt country in Europe and a situation that's very complicated with 1,000 years of history that everybody seems to think started 2 years ago or whatever, a year ago. But we don't care about all of these other things that are much worse. I just find it really not super interesting. And so I think that it's like Chamath has that statement, it doesn't approach my level when he was talking about the Uyghurs. I
Mhm.
just don't think that it's seemly for us to print all of this infinite money. We don't really see inflation in the US, although now we are in our food prices. And then that guy lit himself on fire in Tripoli. What is that? Libya, right?
Mhm.
That kicked off the Arab Spring 10 years ago. And that was a great financial crisis, printing of infinite money situation. Right. I find this very unseemly. So yeah, I don't particularly like.
It's interesting. It's the first time I've heard it put in other ways. It's the first time I've heard of the seemliness test, but I get it that with great power comes great responsibility, to be glib again.
I don't think it's glib at all. I'm a huge netizen. And I think that the battle of my lifetime is between institutions and networks. And
Mm.
institutions and networks have a unique bipolar relationship between authority and responsibility. So in the institution, they divorce authority and responsibility. So you have situations where Anthony Fauci will create a virus potentially, and then it kills 7.7 million people allegedly, and he bears no responsibility for that. I
Mhm.
fundamentally disagree with that. And
Yep.
I believe that on the internet, the people that we look to are the ones that are the most authentic. And those are the ones where we link authority and responsibility. So if the US is going to have the authority to set the world's reserve currency, and it doesn't really matter how we got there, we're there now, then we also have the responsibility to act as a good steward with that. And I know I'm in the minority there because a lot of people are just very realpolitik about it. And they're like, yep, we won, they lost, now they suffer. I don't see why we need to do that when we have more than enough food and shelter for everyone in the US. Like why we need to do that for everybody else.
I also feel like as long as we've got huge and rising problems at home, it's hard to basically be in a position to tell other people how to run their countries, even if we stridently disagree with how they run their countries. And we've also failed a number of times at invading and nation building and stuff like that, and that doesn't seem to have taught us much. You said something about basically the dollar being the reserve currency and all that. I'm curious if you have a take on whether or not some kind of crypto, possibly Bitcoin, something else, could eventually achieve that kind of status, because the one thing you can say about cryptocurrency that you can't say about fiat is it's predictable in terms of its supply and in terms of what the rules are for moving it around in general. And that seems to be of intrinsic value that fiat that doesn't have and has even less of over time.
Yeah, I think it's possible theoretically, but I think before we get there, people need to understand why the dollar is the reserve currency and why it's not going away anytime soon. And it's not this sort of made up petrodollar story. It's very simple. If I'm an Argentinian manufacturer and I need to pay for raw materials from Madagascar, I don't transact in Argentinian pesos and whatever Madagascar's
Hmm.
currency is. I switch immediately into dollars. So even though the money that's being transferred is between Argentina and Madagascar, the transaction is done in dollars. And the reason why it's done in dollars is because it's the most liquid currency and because the US has the most stable, um, basically criminal justice system to adjudicate any kind of dispute that arises as a function of being in that currency. Now, you can argue all you want about corruption and blah, blah, blah. And if you pay enough money as a VC to certain politicians, they'll call a bailout, not a bailout. I get it. Okay. Like the US is not without problems. However, most people still believe that the US system as a whole, which is why there's always a flight to US treasuries whenever there's an issue, or US real estate whenever there's an issue internationally. They still believe the US government is the most legitimate and the US justice system is the most legitimate. And so before we talk about, oh, the Chinese and the Russians and the Saudi Arabians are going to transact for oil in different currencies, they're not going to do that because the Chinese don't trust the Russians, don't trust the Saudi Arabians on their own currencies. They don't trust the US either, but they trust the US more, which is why they transact in dollars. And
So
all
what about the recent kind of announced alliance, the kind of through alliance between China, Russia, and Saudi Arabia? It seems to me like they are trying to
like I
undermine
said,
or overthrow the petrodollar.
yes, sure. It's great from a headline standpoint. The proof will be when the companies in those countries are doing normal transactions between each other, not in US dollars.
So you're basically saying the thesis is yet to be shown, has yet to be proven.
I think it's totally nonsense. And what really smart finance people that I speak to also say the same thing, which is every single day, it's something like $10 trillion worth of transactions are happening in dollars. And it's 2 orders of magnitude bigger than anything else, which it means liquidity and like its stability. So why would you come in with a new currency that doesn't have that same level of liquidity? I just don't see it happening right now. It needs to be happening at a small level. So it's great. Good job, guys. Do the Petra nonsense. We'll see how it works out.
The
And
petro yuan.
if it turns out that's actually a stable thing, maybe it will be a stable thing. But I don't see it. I don't see
Mhm.
it happening. Oh, and we see Matt is requesting to speak.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was just wanting to hear what your opinion was about like the whole theory that the US can basically print energy via the dollar. Can you elaborate on that a little bit more? I had heard that the other day on a space and they said that with the US dollar that they can basically just print energy because everything energy wise pretty much is sold in US dollars. So what do you see with the future of that?
Well, that's not a thing, right? And that's because of the second law of thermodynamics, which states that energy is neither created nor destroyed. And I know that's weird esoterically to talk about in this context because you're actually not talking about energy like that. But what I'm saying is that every action in the system has a trade off. So when the US prints money, it may not affect you in a real perceptible way, Matt, but it definitely affects somebody somewhere perceptibly.
Part of, I think, the SVB collapse we witnessed is due to a huge amount of money being injected into the economy to try to stimulate the economy, and the fact that the Fed had interest rates so low that money was basically free, and then had to start raising rates to deal with the inflation caused by the injection of money, causing the bonds being held by organizations like SVB to tank and essentially to have no markets for their bonds. And in which case that they found themselves unable to cover their deposits. So these things have ripple effects. And is that fairly accurate from your perspective?
That's not really what I saw happening.
Okay.
So I have maybe an alternate theory about what happened at Silicon Valley Bank. First of all, I think that every bank had the situation that Silicon Valley Bank had. And it was worse at Silicon Valley Bank because they were not really paying attention from a risk management perspective, because being a bank that was doing risk management was not really their thing. Their thing was more like non-banking things, right? They were innovating technologically. So you could say they were making payments, APIs, blah, blah, blah. But then they were also doing things that didn't really make a lot of sense. So if you look at the history of Silicon Valley Bank, there's some things that don't make a lot of sense. And one of those things is that when venture capitalists were putting money into startups, they were giving more money to startups who were willing to say, we'll keep all of the money in Silicon Valley Bank. That's very strange. Okay. So I'll grant you that the whole like bond, low yield, high yield, low interest rates, high interest rates certainly makes for a very compelling rationale for why the bank run happened at Silicon Valley Bank, but not for why they were uniquely susceptible and why them then. That whole story doesn't really make a ton of sense.
Let me explain why it didn't proceed beyond Silicon Valley Bank. But as an investor yourself, I'm sure you're looking at banks going, why are you taking risks that investors take? You're not an investor, you're a bank. You're supposed to be very conservative about how you deal with people's money. And what you're saying is that Silicon Valley Bank was giving people a perverse incentive to take higher risks by putting all their money in Silicon Valley Bank.
Yeah, what I'm saying is I believe that Silicon Valley Bank was probably not what it seems to be, and somebody was trying to do something that they didn't seem to be doing. And then there was a this and that happened. What I'm saying is I believe that this whole situation was political. I don't think that it was financial. So I don't think this has anything to do with the value of money or the blah, blah, blah. I think it actually is just somebody didn't like something that somebody else was doing. And so they figured out a way to make that go away. And it backfired from my perspective on what was going on. And that's why I believe you saw the government, the US government, specifically the Treasury Department, do a 180-degree turn from Friday to Sunday on
Within
their
12 hours, right?
Yes. And if you were to ask me, like, this is what happened, they were very interested in Silicon Valley Bank being allowed to fail. And then they became very uninterested in it being allowed to fail. And specifically as it relates to whether or not uninsured depositors were going to be made whole. That was very strange.
That was a real neck snapper. And something happened. Some calls were made in between there and some
Well,
conversations were had.
so I'll
Yeah.
explain from my perspective what happened was they were happy to see the bank fail, except that when you say we're not going to insure deposits above a certain amount, if I'm a business that's paying payroll from a local bank in Illinois, then why do I want to hold $5 million in my local bank in Illinois when the government just allowed Silicon Valley Bank to fail and all of their uninsured deposits went away? And so what was happening was that the structurally important banks, let's say JP Morgan or Bank of America or whomever, they were receiving billions and billions of dollars on Friday and Saturday from local banks all over the US. In fact, they still are, because why would you want to go and have your cash that you need to have in order to pay payroll at a local bank? And the problem is that JP Morgan does not make loans in Bumblefuck, Illinois. And so if the bank that was making loans in Bumblefuck, Illinois loses its deposits, then the economy of Bumblefuck, Illinois goes away. And so if I'm the Treasury Department, I don't want to see that happening. And so that was why I believe they changed their mind on letting Silicon Valley Bank fail. And it was a very close call for all of those people who were doing this and that with Silicon Valley Bank. And
They're very clear that Silicon Valley Bank has failed, that they've taken it over, started with like the National Deposit Corporation of Santa Clara to replace it. And essentially it's occupying the same offices, but it's a different company now.
yeah, but then all of the APIs and all that stuff and all the people that were employed there, I think just give it a couple months and see what it looks like. I agree with you that the equity and debt holders in the bank perhaps are not going to be made whole, but let's just wait and see. I'll be very interested. There was a lot of executives at Silicon Valley Bank who've made fairly large sales of the stock previous to the bank
Yep.
going out of business. What's going on? There's a lot of open questions. And again, I don't think this bank has anything to do with the financial system or like how to think about money. I think like I said, I think this was a political situation where something happened politically and then something else happened politically. And I don't think this is the money. I personally don't look at this like a money situation.
If people can't put all their eggs in one basket, or if people feel like they have to spread their deposits out over louder and things to try to even cover it with some kind of government insurance, or they feel like the bank could play fast and loose with their portfolio and then they could lose it all in a failure, that could lead to a perception of systemic risk that it seems to me like the government was trying to stem. And what they've done is, I think Kevin O'Leary pointed this out, is they basically rushed in and said, oh no, we're basically covering all deposits everywhere, no matter how big or how small.
Yes,
because,
right. And the next,
and Kevin O'Leary pointed out that basically amounts to nationalization of the banking system.
correct. They have nationalized the entire banking system. And it's very interesting to me that they functionally made every single bank into an investment bank or a hedge fund by doing this, because they basically said, hey, if you lose all your depositors' money, it's okay. We'll give the money back. And I don't really know how this will evolve. I just think that I think it was bumbled, honestly. But I think that they were running an OODA loop too quickly and they were way over their skis and didn't really fully appreciate what was going on. Because on the other side, like I said, if all the local deposits go away, then all the local lending goes away and then it's game over. So I don't really understand what they want to do. And I'll be very interested to see what Jamie Dimon does in the next few days and weeks in terms of whether or not the banks really have been nationalized or not, or whether he actually starts advocating privately and publicly for more banks in other jurisdictions. But again, it's a very fluid situation. I don't really think it's about money. Again, I think this is about politics. Because like, for example, people have always held more than the FDIC amount for payroll in these banks, even though a lot of these large companies have very sophisticated accounting systems in place in order to reduce their risk. But it's not new that they now have payrolls. This is, like I said, like not really what it appears to be from my perspective.
I wanted to also get back to what Matt mentioned about printing energy and so on. And the way I would think about it is that it's not really printing energy because, like you said, it can't be created or destroyed, but it is a way of moving energy, collecting it as a kind of a tax on people who hold money, and then because you're producing new money and then putting it into a specific place with the new money you printed. Do you think is that a fair way of looking at it?
Oh, absolutely. I think the government, when the government creates inflation, and it was really interesting when I got my MBA at Haas, Janet Yellen was a professor. And so we had the opportunity to ask questions like this. And so I asked, why does the Federal Reserve choose 2% inflation rate? Why not choose 0%? And of course, the answer is because 2% was chosen by New Zealand in the 90s. And since then, all of the central banks of the world have followed, right? But they don't really say that. And then the other thing is we have the technology to make the inflation rate whatever we want, but they pick 2% because it's a great way to steal money from the poor. But nobody can say that, right? I don't worry about inflation because I can buy Treasury and protected securities or equities or whatever. But there's tons of people who are so poor that they're saving like $10, $20 a month. And so they don't have the ability to buy an ETF of the S&P 500 or whatever.
So you're saying that inflation itself is a kind of a regressive tax.
Correct. And it's a tax on the poor. And it's a tax where the government is incentivized to create debt and then inflate it away at some point in the future. And so it's unstated. And so it's very interesting if you ever get these people in a room privately to try and get them to explain these things. Because if they're a true believer, they have to come up with some really crazy gymnastics. And there's very few people who are like, yes, we could pick 2%. If they pick 3%, there's repercussions. They could pick 1%. They could pick 0%, but they pick 2% because, first of all, the historical precedent. And second of all, governments are like 2%. They like it because they can create debt that then goes away at some point.
So As we wind down the conversation, I want to return it to our general kind of themes, which are about thinking better, information environment, and so on. And one of the things that you touched on a number of times, which I'd like to hear you integrate in this conversation, is that if something doesn't really affect you, stop paying attention to it more or less. And it seems to me that for a lot of people, what's going on with the financial crisis right now, we're all in a certain sense concerned about it because we've all got money somewhere and we want it to stay there. But on the other hand, like you said, we should also, as individuals who can create value, focus on creating value and maybe focus less on things that aren't going to change our day-to-day actions. How do you think we should be thinking about these kinds of systemic shocks that we're seeing around us, but aren't necessarily shaking the ground right beneath us?
Yeah, I think that unless you're one of the six guys who runs the world, these things are totally unimportant. And the reason why I say that is because money is socially constructed. And so I'll relate a story to you. So it was October of 2008. And I was on the phone with my mom, and basically she was looking at her terminal and on Wall Street, a Bloomberg terminal. And functionally, you could see there was an electronic bank run. And from all of the data that you could see on that day, I think it was the 18th or the 25th, the US economic system was over. It was done, right? Like there was a huge drawdown of funds. The Federal Reserve crashed in the morning. So they opened the reserve window and they printed like $4 or $5 trillion in a single day. And it was just the largest electronic bank run in history. And everything was finished. And I remember being on the phone with her and it was like, okay, what's going to happen tomorrow? We're all going to wake up and be like, okay, we messed that up, but you're still going to go to work and I'm still going to go to work and we're still going to do all the things that we were going to do. And we'll just make up something else. And that's exactly what always happened. It's just, if you look at this whole like bank run crisis, blah, 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 like what ultimately happened? Nothing. Like if you had less than $250,000 in your account, which is 95% of Americans, nothing happened, right? There's no, the banking system is not going to irrevocably fail. And then we're all going to live in the Stone Age. That's like not a thing.
I've always told people who express skepticism about cryptocurrency, like, what if it fails? What if the computer, I said, if that happens, we have much bigger problems.
Yeah. Okay. So like cryptocurrency is a great example, right? And maybe this will be easier for people to understand. There's been several examples where the founders of a cryptocurrency have behaved unethically, and the users in that currency say, okay, we're just going to fork the currency. We're going to create a new currency, and everyone's holding in the new currency is going to be the same that it was in the old one, except we're not going to do the founder anymore. That's that forking of a currency and moving on to a different chain and cutting out the people that were the bad actors is literally the exact same thing that we see in the world all the time. Anytime somebody comes to you and says, this is going to be an apocalypse and everything is going to fail and we're all going to be like in the poorhouse, that person is selling you bullshit, in my
Well,
opinion.
it strikes me that the people who are climate change alarmists are also in denial about humans' ability to adapt. And it sounds like that's what you're referring to as well, is we adapt to these things. And hopefully we learn from them too, but we adapt.
I think ESG is just the latest way for certain entities to funnel money to certain other entities. I don't think it has anything to do with the climate, right? Anybody who spends 10 minutes looking at climate change will tell you that the solution is 100% natural gas or baseload nuclear with natural gas on top of that, like cogeneration plants. It's not even a question. There's any sophomore in college can do the math. It's not hard. So it's not a thing, right? Like you want to reduce carbon, blah, 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 do all the things the climate change people say do. Right. Baseload nuclear, the rest of it, cogen, natural gas. We have tons of natural gas, tons and tons. It's ridiculous how much.
Yeah, we're flaring it off in the Midwest because it's like it was useless. Like
you can look at pictures of North and South Dakota from space today versus 30 years ago. And it's just insane, like the light pollution from all the things that are on fire, let alone all the other places in the world where nobody cares. So yeah, the climate change, I don't even listen to that because people are not interested in solving that. They're interested in making a problem so they can direct money from one place to another. Again, I get back to your question, which is what should we do about people saying the sky is falling? We should understand that our reality is socially constructed and things will just sort themselves out. And for the most part, none of us really needs to care about a world ending apocalypse because unless we get hit with a meteor, it's not going to be world ending. We're just going to wake up tomorrow morning and decide as a group, okay, now we're doing it like this.
I'm not sure if this is our 10th conversation or not. I know we've reached the 10, but what you just said about reality being a social construction, I agree and I don't. I'm not quite sure how to articulate that at the moment, but that might be, if we have another conversation, a topic to delve more deeply into. To what extent is reality socially constructed, and what does that mean for
Yeah.
us?
Okay. Let me explain to you. So
Sure.
if you look up at the sky right now, and I were to ask you, what color is the sky? Prior to 1950, 99% of people who've ever lived would say sky's blue. Okay. Except if you were some autistic guy in Germany in the 19th century, then you would say the sky technically has no color and it's the nitrogen in the atmosphere that scatters the light that
Sure.
makes it blue. But most people don't understand that. And they didn't understand that until the first satellites went into orbit and they took pictures of the Earth and they saw with great clarity everything on the ground. And so
Right.
it's impossible once you've seen those pictures to say that the sky is blue. And yet, the sky is blue is the most independently, objectively verifiable experimental observation in the history of humanity. And it's totally false. And if you were to ask me, Michael, what color is the sky? I would tell you it's blue.
Of course, if you frame the question more carefully, on a clear day, what is the dominant wavelengths your eye is receiving? It's going to be in the range we call blue, regardless of whether or not the atmosphere is transparent or
I
how it
know,
scatters
but
things. So
we're social creatures, Wolf. And so
Mhm.
you can always add more precision. But when you add more precision, you're going to reduce the general accuracy of the statement to the point where it's not true for most people. And so that's what I say when we say that things are socially constructed. It turns out that there's very few things that are objectively true.
then
Even
how do you,
math-
I got to stop you there though, because then how do you push back on people who then say, of course, sex and gender are socially constructed? As you and
so
I,
the way
can agree that men and women are a fact of reality, and that, and I don't have any problem with people living the way they want or respecting them as individuals. But yeah, but at the same time, there are people who are basically trying to queer everything right now,
no, I
including,
get
yeah.
yeah.
Talk
And the
about
thing
that for a
is,
moment.
there's always it's a continuum, right? There's a continuum for anything between objective reality and subjective reality. And the reason why we choose certain values for things and certain values for other things is that our experienced reality, our ability to make predictions about our own personal experience is better with certain socially constructed ideas than others. It's a
And I
very
completely agree with that. So,
yeah,
go ahead.
it's a very unhappy way to put it because people want you to be like, no, like sex is biologically determined. You're like, actually, this is a problem that the sports federations have dealt with for 50 years. Is it chromosomes? Is it hormones? Is it like you go on and on? And it's very actually quite difficult at the periphery to make a determination. And yet we're able to say, like, this is a man, this is a woman in order for us to make predictions about it, right? There's a big difference between saying men are taller than women. And you need to know that because you're designing some device for men or for women, and you're trying to figure out what size it should be versus needing to understand why men are taller than women. And so this precision and accuracy trade-off in what is and what is not socially constructed versus objectively real is something that we have a challenge with. And this is fundamentally one of the challenges of the modern era is that we've gone from a very Newtonian cause and effect reductionist world to a very quantum mechanical things are relative to your position in the ecology. And is that ecology the information ecology, the actual like ecology that you live in from an embodied standpoint, et cetera, and reconciling this idea of quantum information. That's something that we haven't figured out how to do yet, right? And
Well, I
that's
think, as you've said in previous conversations, this also makes us more prone to having conversations that instead of taking us from A to B, leave us arguing about what A is.
correct.
And that seems like that, as you put it mildly, that's a challenge.
Yes, that's why I say that we as a society are in the midst of a transition from consensus-based decision making and reality understanding to resonance-based decision making and reality understanding. And that transition is very chaotic, and we're seeing the effects of that everywhere. But the experience for most people is, what should I think about? The thing is, don't think about stuff that you can't affect personally and that doesn't really matter to you. I promise you, if you're a productive member of society today and you don't die today and you live to tomorrow, you'll be a productive member of society tomorrow. And your relative position in society will remain the same, regardless of what glass, sand turned into glass database we've decided upon, right? Money is made up. It's totally made up. So I would not sweat any of this stuff if you can't personally do anything about it.
I agree with that fundamental point of view that, that money is a consensual hallucination, and ultimately it comes down to what kind of person are you, and are you able to create value for the people around you and even for society as a whole. And that's really is what matters and should matter to each of us. We're basically out of our hour here. Only one person raised their hand, but of course, if anybody has any really last minute comments, but Michael, would you like to let people know where to find you?
Yes, you can look for me here on Twitter at Michael Gimmerin. Like I said, I will continue to talk about this switch from consensus-based reality to resonance-based reality, from institutions to networks. I find it fascinating. I believe it's going to take the rest of my life. So as you think about it a decade from now, feel free to reach out and ask me a question about it. I don't think it's going away. And as always, I'm really grateful for the opportunity to talk and to share with you, Wolf.
Yeah. And this will, as I mentioned at the start, this will be up at youtube.com/@BewareOfWolf podcast. And I'm Wolf McNally, creator of Flying Logic. And I really thank everybody who showed up and listened. Thank you, Matt, for chiming in, and see you next week.
Cheers, everyone.
All right. Bye, everybody.